Mhm. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Who's to Blame? How Technical Debt Upholds Marginalization and How You Can Survive It. The advice in this session was written for Black, Indigenous, people of color, that kind of audience, but all of you are welcome to be here and take away from some of the lessons learned. In fact, I think if you're in leadership positions, you should think about how you can help support and uplift some of the issues that I'll be talking about. My name is Fatima. Bio slides are another form of technical debt, so I did not bother to fill this one out. I am a developer programs engineer at Pantheon, where I work on maintaining developer tools and demos, delivering trainings, and speaking at conferences like this one. In other stuff I do, I'm a chaos wrangler at an organization called the Bad Idea Factory. We like to make people think about world issues, and I run an Anita B mentorship circle, which kind of defines a lot of my talks now because the women in that circle really offer me a lot of good, candid feedback and share with me what they're going through in a way that it's really private, but it also allows me to reflect a lot more. So highly recommend mentoring if you're not doing it already. You should mentor with Didi and I. You can find me on the internet as Sugar Overflow. My life's work consists of open source, civic tech, and being an advocate for those who don't have the privilege of speaking at conferences like this one. If you've worked in tech for a bit, chances are that you've encountered technical debt. To write good software, developers have to follow a lot of best practices. Those things can be like design patterns, code structures, coding guidelines, test coverage, documentation, and lots more things that I couldn't think of when I put this talk together. But in practice, as all of us probably know, deadlines, budgets, clients can mean that we have to work a lot faster and end up making a lot of compromises along the way in order to release things as quickly as possible. And those compromises and time constraints and budget constraints can often lead to the technical debt just piling up until it's this mountain that maybe you can't take care of, or this house that isn't quite a house that you've built. And some of those compromises come at the cost of things that are really, really important, like documentation. And without the plans to support those, teams think, I'll just figure it out later, or I'll just add the accessibility testing at the end, or we'll take care of the documentation at the end of the sprint. But the time to make those improvements isn't going to arrive if you don't make the time for it. So this is kind of the problem that we're going to talk about today. Yeah, we'll get to it later. It's definitely the kiss of death for accessibility. Thanks, Jen. When I was originally proposing this talk, I was thinking specifically about my current role and the amount of debt that I have inherited for a specific project at Pantheon that has been critical to some of our biggest customers and was really overwhelming to become the maintainer of. But as I was spending time thinking about tech debt and talking to people, I discovered that this happens to everyone at every job. And it's also something that I maybe didn't notice at previous organizations I was at, just because I think I felt like it was part of my job and that I shouldn't complain about it. And so that's something that I wanted to share with all of you today. So not all technical debt is the same. I'm discovering that technical debt in the context of racial inequalities, or when inherited from someone at an organization that has more privilege, a higher status, maybe they're a senior developer and you're a junior developer, there's a level of hierarchy there, and it definitely affects the type of technical debt and creates a unique challenge for you, and also repercussions for future passage of technical debt. And I'm still exploring this concept, but as I'm exploring, I want to share some of the things that I've learned, sometimes through trial by fire, things I wish I knew that I could equip myself with and that maybe you can equip yourself with, languages, tools, and questions that you can ask so you can survive. Notice that I use the word survive and not succeed or thrive, because I think figuring this out is an ongoing process and we are going to learn it together. So here we go. When I think about technical debt, I think about it like a cycle with 5 main stages. And a cycle more than a series of stages, because as long as a project continues to live, so does its technical debt cycle. the first thing is identifying, so recognizing and understanding where that tech debt is coming from. Then you assess it. So you size it up and you figure out what the scale of the impact of the debt is, who is it hurting the most, and what value would you get from fixing it. And then planning and bargaining is really where you'll be figuring out, how do I deal with this? How do I plan ahead so more of it doesn't happen? And how do I not burn out while repaying this debt by filling the gap, writing the documentation? Arguably, the repayment is the hardest part. No timing app. I do not want to update right now. Sorry. No amount of planning can help with repaying your technical debt, really, but it's a good idea to plan to suffer less. And finally, mitigating. So making sure that your technical debt continues to be addressed either by you or the rest of your team or all of you together. I don't think that there is a way to completely prevent it, but there are ways that you can keep it manageable. Jen in the chat is mentioning that there's parallels between this cycle and the cycle of grief. How it's uncanny. And it's funny you mentioned that, because this slide is inspired by my experience with the Kubler-Ross cycle of grief, which goes from denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and ultimately ends with acceptance. But unfortunately, in grief, like many things with life, you don't really go through the stages in order. It's more like, and then somehow you end up at acceptance, but it's not quite acceptance. And then you all over again and end up at acceptance again. And so much like grief, technical debt doesn't really follow this charted cycle path. You will have to jump around a lot, and things can get quite messy in practice, but you can equip yourself to do your best. So the first step in that cycle is identifying and recognizing the signs of technical debt, what causes it, and how it tends to happen. One of the ways that you can sense that there's technical debt is when there's a lot going on in your code, project, tool, or service. It's not necessarily that it's messy, but that there are several systems or integrations or pockets of complexity when making a change that feels really, really straightforward. Maybe it just takes a lot of hours and you kind of think you're going crazy, but it's not you. That code probably has a lot of technical debt. Another way that I discovered this personally was the number of puzzle pieces that I had to collect in order to understand a project. So the iceberg that I was looking at actually had several people holding different pieces of the puzzle, but nobody with this full sense of what that project was. And going through that journey of running around and picking up these pieces made me realize that this debt was a lot bigger than I had originally, or anyone had originally understood it to be. One model that you'll see people refer to is Martin Fowler's technical debt quadrant. So this helps people characterize different types of technical debt. Fowler proposes that technical debt is inevitable, and you should expect it as a part of your projects. However, there are different ways that it comes to being, and this quadrant can help us with that. So when you're thinking about the debt that you have, you can think about, was this deliberate? Did the team know that when they introduced this new feature, it was going to be a lot of work? Maybe it has a really big learning curve, like a CMS, we all know. And there was a deliberate decision to be like, this is worth it. We will onboard everyone, and we will make sure there's guides or customer documents in order to handle this technical debt. So for me, that kind of situation falls under deliberate and prudent, where we're planning for something, we know we're taking on a big risk, and we're going to work towards mitigating that. But other projects fall everywhere else on this quadrant, and most of the projects that I've been handed down fall on the bottom row of this quadrant, where the move fast and break things mentality leads to reckless decisions or experimental projects, and that these projects are written really quickly, but they end up being really, really important, but we're not built with the deliberation to be sustained forever. Or projects that were built with a plan, but not thought out to the point of what are the repercussions of adding a really large new feature? Or what if we replace the entire team of developers with a new team? How is this project going to grow? And I think of those as inadvertent, reckless projects where you didn't mean it, but it was reckless and it's going to end up being someone else's headache in the long run. So conversations around this set of quadrants can help you identify what are the characteristics and complexity of the technical debt that you're dealing with? And then hopefully this can be, the starting point for having some really honest conversations of, okay, if we messed up, how do we go from where we are now to what's next, and figuring out how you can tackle problems in a way that works well. Just telling Taryn that she's very helpful when she tells me I'm going too fast because I just keep getting nervous. Thank you, Taryn. Stage 2 is assessing the scale of your technical debt. So basically, you know that there's tech debt in this project, and now it's time to figure out how you do damage control. So assessing the scale of the technical debt is how hard will it be to pay off? How are you going to achieve that payoff? And that really varies on a project to project basis. It depends on how many systems there are, whether it's an independent project or part of a tool infrastructure ecosystem of a million things connected to each other that no one quite knows except that one guy, how it all works together. And so all of those things will change how complex assessing the scale is. Also thinking about, are you familiar with the language, the libraries, or the frameworks that are used? Are they out of date? Do they contain security vulnerabilities? And so assessment is a time to build and run through a checklist and make sure that you think about it as, if I were launching a new project, what are all the things that I would consider? And then apply that to, now that I have an existing project, what are the things that may have been considered and are out of date or haven't been considered and need to be addressed? So when you're trying to understand the impact of the technical debt, consider your time investment, because this can be a really long rabbit hole that you may not want to go down. But in order for you to get ahead with working on fixing this product, it's best to figure out what kind of resources, impact, and accountability it has. So worked on it before me? Why was it created? Did they leave documentation? Is it up to date? If not, who's supposed to be updating it? And then some questions that might get you into hot water, like, what was the goal of this project? Was the goal achieved? And if so, what are the new goals as part of bringing me onto this project? For example, when I took on a specific project, the goal was to release the next version of the project. Once that was released, there was a moment where I was like, now what? I did what you asked me to do. Why am I still carrying this technical debt burden? And so that's a really good question to ask. But before you start asking that, start going around asking for background and context. Talk to people on your team that you can trust. Chances are that, if it's a really big ton of debt, nobody wants to be accountable for it. So once you start asking these questions, people are going to get really uncomfortable. And so keep your receipts. Every marginalized individual will tell you that receipts are integral to your survival. The key here is survival. So when people tell you information about a project, who worked on it, who supported it, or why it needs to be updated, please keep receipts on those meetings. Keep track of the information that you've been giving. Figure out, is this a customer-facing tool? Why does the customer care about this product? What do they use it for? Try to figure out what the value is, and ultimately try to figure out, if I shut down this project today, tomorrow, or next week, who will be angry and who will actually suffer? So there will be people that will be angry about it, but there will be other people who actually matter that are receiving value from this project who won't receive that value anymore. And it's really hard to separate those two and make that distinction and be like, well, you're just mad that I don't want to do this work. And you're mad because you actually need this, and you're the people that I need to talk to in order to figure out how I can continue to support this project so that it continues to support your needs. And then assess the resource needs. So what are the resources needed for this project to succeed? Does your team have the right people, right knowledge to make this work? If not, do you have the power to hire more people? Likely not, or support or resources? If not, who does, and how can you get them on board? Are there servers, services, skill sets that you need? And then once you've figured these out, I want you to take a moment and review them again, because if you're anything like me, you're going to be like, it's okay, I can take care of everything. And you might be inclined to rise to that challenge, even if certain things in this list of resources are not in your wheelhouse. And I will tell you that working harder to meet those demands that are outside of the scope of your role is exhausting and will lead to burnout, and you are not being paid for it. So make a list of resources and know that it is okay to point out that this project or tool cannot survive unless you provide resources in order to sustain it. And you don't have to be the developer, the designer, the product manager, the code reviewer, the account manager, and all of those things should not be your role. If they are, I hope you're being paid for it. I'm certainly not. And the other thing that is important to mention here is that just because you don't have the skills to maintain this gigantic project does not equal that you are not an amazing developer. These two things are not equivalent. The skill sets needed or the resources that are missing is not a reflection of your worth as a professional. And that's something that I think gets forgotten when you're stressed and you're carrying a burden all by yourself and doing all this labor and having the inclination, as we all usually do, to rise to the challenge. Just remember, those two things are not the same. You can be amazing. This project can continue to be a shit show. It's not your fault. Also, it is someone's job to make sure that projects, tools, and services are sufficiently resourced. So talk to that person and make sure they're doing their job. One of the major issues I faced while dealing with resourcing challenges is autonomy. And this is one of those things that you will have to deal with especially, but not limited to, because you're a person of color. So when you're assessing the technical debt, try to get a sense for what decisions you'll be in charge of making. So if you can, try to be explicit, like, if I'm maintaining this thing, do I get the final say on features, new features, or deprecating features? And if not me, then who? And the sad reality is that a lot of people will say, oh, yeah, I trust you to make decisions. And I have faith that you will make the right decisions. But when it comes time to deprecating something or closing something or closing a bunch of issues on GitHub, people will start pushing back. And people will start pushing back with the most wild, reasons. And honestly, I think a part of it will be like, they don't see you as someone who is capable of making decisions, or in their minds, someone who is a technical expert who has the ability and competence and clout to be able to manage a project at such a scale doesn't look like you. And so even if they mean well, they might be bringing some of that bias into the decision-making structure. And so it's really important to figure out, what are the decisions you can make? And if there aren't, and you don't have any autonomy and you are not able to prioritize things on the project you're working on, then that's a point where you should stop now and reconsider fixing this before you move on. I haven't figured out a good solution for this. Usually I just burn out and then leave the organization, or I burn out while raising a red flag and screaming and then show up to a meeting crying. And then somebody realizes that, it's gotten really bad and something needs to be done. And so if you have a more constructive solution for regaining autonomy over technical debt projects, I am happy to hear it. Stage 3, planning. So this is the part where everyone comes to the table and says, we've got this monster, we understand what this debt is, and now we're going to talk about how we're going to deal with it. But let's face it, none of our colleagues, managers, or team leads are interested in the idea of setting paid work time aside to fix technical debt, because it's not shiny and it's not an early access thing for our customers. And the act of fixing it is just a burden that they're going to throw on someone and then treat like invisible work and not acknowledge. I've been holding on to that for several weeks. Let's break that down for a second. Think about all the times that someone at your organization received praise or congratulations for a job well done, or props for something they completed. And were any of those cases because they spent hours and hours or weekends to catch up on a technical backlog for technical debt project, or refactored a bunch of code to make it readable, or made a project less complex? If yes, that's so amazing. Tell me where you work and how they figured that out. If no, then you probably hear a lot of sympathy and apologies like I do, and sometimes like this comment, shock and confusion, because the people we work with don't understand what technical debt is. And how can you work in tech and not understand what technical debt is? But that is also a problem you'll face. One of the major issues I faced when working with all this debt was prioritization, getting my team and my organization to care enough about the technical debt that had accrued in order to address it. And so a couple of steps that I have thought about after the fact. So the first step is, let's talk about the negative assumptions of debt. All technical debt's not bad, and it doesn't necessarily have to be complicated. So if your team is willing to break it down, make it less complex, it doesn't have to be this massive thing no one can figure out. The second thing, figure out what the business value is. Figure out how your organization sees value in things and how they measure what priorities are, and then figure out how you can make this work valuable to them. What teams are using it and who will benefit from resolving this debt. So like, remember the research you did where you were trying to figure out the value that this, product brings to customers? You kind of have to twist that now and be like, well, if this doesn't get fixed, that really big customer is going to be mad. And so you kind of have to like twist it around and play the money game. If there's one thing I learned, to be really, really super real with you for a second, don't tweet me about this. Companies really care about the money. And I know that we love the work we do and that we're really passionate about the places we work. And those places often care about us and our well-being. But disclaimer aside, it's good to remember that the ultimate decision maker at a lot of agencies is money. And if you can prove that there is a risk to churn, if there's a customer that's going to leave, or there's a financial loss, they will definitely get on board with resolving that technical debt. Hopefully, you don't have to continue proving the ownership of the value of the project. But step 3 is show them what the cost of ownership looks like over time. So be like, in 1 year, you're going to need to hire somebody with this skill set. In 2 years, as these dependencies grow, you'll have to hire somebody with this skill set and this skill set. 3 years, 5 years, scare them and show them how many people they'll have to hire. Throw in the salaries of people at those levels and show them that, like, if you don't address this now, this project will grow until you need a team to support it. And if you don't want to end up there having to hire a whole team because you love your money too much, you should probably invest in this project right now. And I think of that as, if I don't have power, I have to find sources of power in my organization in order to wield their power. Whether that is customers, other people, higher ups, people who are willing to stick their neck out for you. Find sources of power and then find a way to wield them if you don't have it. And finally, make a plan to repay that technical debt. You're all familiar with things like this. Make a roadmap, break it into sizable chunks, make sure that it's a part of your everyday work. If you're using a system to prioritize work or do assessments like OKRs or sprint points or quarterly goals, make sure that it's in there. Don't do this on your nights and weekends. Trust me, you will hate yourself for it. And if you start making sure that it's inside your OKRs and quarterly goals and things like that, eventually down the line, paying off technical debt or mitigating it will be part of your team's culture organically. And so you're kind of seeding it in there with a lot of fight now, but know that, 10 years from now, the dev that takes your place will have a better time, hopefully. And then repayment. Before you start repaying technical debt, you have to think about who's going to work on paying it, who's accountable to make sure that it happens. Hopefully there's more people than you doing it. I think back to when you sign a loan and you go through 900 million checks and they want to make sure you can handle your money and that you're trustworthy and this bullshit and this and that. And they'll poke and prod at everything. And sadly, I think repaying technical debt involves a lot of trust. And unfortunately, if you're underrepresented in technology, you have to work really, 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 really hard to build trust with your teammates and your organizations. And there's a lot working against you in that regard. So my advice to you would be like, make sure that there is going to be accountability around the technical debt that you're going to repay. I struggle with this myself. I often feel like people misjudge how serious I am because I'm usually just cheerful and young and laughing, and they don't understand how bad something is until I'm literally in tears, and I'm sick of being literally in tears on Zoom calls. So my heart goes out to everyone who is burnt out or stressed out to the point where you just hate going to work every day. And I think technical debt, this is where I learned that like it's more than just a technical thing. It's this intersectional kind of burden dumpster fire that you're carrying all by yourself and dragging to work every day, especially if you don't have resources or it's not being acknowledged or celebrated. And so how do we counteract that and equip ourselves to deal with that? And I may only have 10 minutes left. Oh, 4 minutes left. Okay. If I don't finish, I'll record it and send it to you. Ways to repay your technical debt. Set expectations, have upfront conversations about the debt you're addressing, and then a process for who's going to address it. Is there time, resources allocated to it? A RACI can help with that process. So you can make sure that even though you're doing the work, somebody else should also be responsible for making sure that it happens. And that way, you're not the only one you're going to point to when you're like, hey, I asked for resources, but you never allocated them, so it never got done. And so make sure you're not alone. Second, build a schedule and then make time. Do what you must to block off your calendar, make it a daily or weekly or quarterly practice to address, check in, and work on that debt. Schedule co-working times as a team to do it together. That way it's all in the open and everyone knows that it's being worked on. And then 3, document every time new debt occurs. In the process of repayment, you might find that you're replacing functionality or adding a better way to do things, or updating something that you're not familiar with something that you are familiar with. So make sure that you document those so that you don't end up in a loop of technical debtception. Stole that from Twitter. Or worse, leave that for the next person who gets hired. And then finally, use tools to automate what you can. There are some really cool plugins that can help you assess or keep track of technical debt in your IDE. I found one on GitHub specifically written for Drupal called PHP Debt. It only has 11 stars, so your mileage may vary, but I think that's a good outlet to look for. Are there ways that you can automate your process, automate looking for security vulnerabilities with something sync? And so that might save you some of the time as you're going through this debt payment. And then the thing that really broke me about all of this technical debt is the visibility of the work. So the closest thing I can relate it to is grief. Like sometimes I'll just make tea and it'll taste like the tea my dad made. And then I'll just start crying before my meeting with my CMO. Those are the kinds of like unexpected moments where we slowly, gradually learn to pick ourselves up and put ourselves together and ultimately like learn to live with grief. And I think a lot of times invisible work is like that a lot too, where as underrepresented folks, we have a tendency to take on all kinds of work that people expect us to take on and just take it on with a smile and work harder and harder to meet these high standards we've set for ourselves. And for me personally, that's because I do that to prove that I'm good enough, because I worry that I'm not good enough and that I'm an imposter. And so I have this like standard that's centuries high and I just can't reach it. And taking on technical debt is one way that I just keep feeding that demon that tells me that I'm not good enough. And so be cautious of your imposter syndrome and whether it's feeding into the invisible work, and make sure that the work that you're doing is acknowledged. So talk to your coworkers, rant to your coworkers if you need to, if they're trusted, and share the burden or complexity of the work. If you're sick of telling your manager to prioritize something, go to a coworker and ask them to do it for you. There is no shame in having someone escalate something for you if you have been trying so hard and hitting a wall. Because in my head, I was always like, maybe I haven't tried hard enough to communicate the severity of the situation. And chances are I have tried, and it's time for someone else to support me in trying. So don't do all of the invisible work in the shadows all alone. Tara says, tell that imposter syndrome demon to come talk to them. They'll fight it for you. ++, A+, highly recommend. I have ranted to Tara for 1.5 years, and Tara has stuck their neck out to help get some of this invisible work acknowledged. So thank you, Tara. In the interest of only 5 minutes left, I will go a little quickly over this section and then get to the end. Mitigating future technical debt. So, when you try to look up, like, I have a cold, what should I do? They usually tell you like one whole page of, here's what not to do next time so you don't get a cold again. And then they get to the remedy. And so I think with technical debt too, there's no real prevention. There's just a lot of like, do all this so that you don't end up here. And some of the things that you can do are creating onboarding, offboarding processes, establishing development practices or standards so that things are consistent across the board and it's easier to manage some of the craft of the work that you're doing. And then having a technical strategy, make technical debt a part of your daily practices as a team, and hopefully that will get built in for the long run. Oops. Part of this is also fostering cultures where things like development practices, documentation, testing, roadmaps, project management are valuable. And this may not be in your control, unfortunately. But if you are someone who is in a leadership position at your organization, try to think about how you can create a culture like this. For example, our docs team at Pantheon, led by Carolyn Shannon, who is our manager of technical docs, she's done a fabulous job of creating a culture where docs are celebrated, appreciated, valued, and employees are more willing to contribute to docs because they know that there is a value to it and they know that they'll get props for it. And so, foster that culture and it will actually work in practice. And this is kind of the end of the cycle. You've learned to mitigate your technical debt. The cycle starts over. In grief, the last stage of grief cycles is acceptance. And so in many ways, like, once you go from mitigating your technical debt to identifying it again, it's kind of like you've accepted that technical debt is forever a part of your career. So end of the cycle. But really important last question is this technical debt worth it? And oftentimes when I give career-related talks, I get really nervous, but also I hear from the audience about all the things that they've struggled with, and it reminds me how powerless they are in some of these situations. And so it's really easy for me to give advice not knowing what context you're in. So that reminds me that I'm like really privileged that I even get to talk about and complain about technical debt as a part of my job. And one of the things that I advise women in my mentorship circle when they're trying to determine if it's worth it is, a balancing activity so that before you get to the point where it's eating you inside, you can assess it a little bit sooner. And so what that looks like is this. On one side, you have your organization and what they provide to you. That might be things that are the reason you joined the job or why you enjoy your job. For me, speaking at conferences, interesting projects, impactful work that makes a better world. All of these things are important. Some of them are heavier than others. On the other side, there are things that you bring to your organization. So skills, background, hard work, clout. For me, that's the passion. And on that side also goes this massive technical project with a lot of messy technical debt and how heavy it is. And so when I come to this balance, I think, well, is this technical debt way heavier than what the company is providing me? And I would encourage you to think about that. How heavy is your technical debt? What does it cost you to continue to sustain and repay it? And is this organization you work for supporting you enough to, in return, to make that balance even? And if not, that's a conversation that you need to have. Can circumstances be changed in order to even this balance? If there are things that can't be fixed, DDI Careers is a channel on Drupal Slack where you can find another opportunity that's probably better for you. So make your balance, figure out what weighs how much, and take it from there. Finally, remember to be kind to yourselves. We carry so much on a daily basis. Our interactions with our coworkers, the little things people say, the courage to correct your name when someone says it wrong, the exhaustion you feel when you're tired of correcting it. And it's really hard to be ourselves and the sometimes not quite ourselves, but filtered version of ourselves that we have to be at work in order to succeed. And so technical debt is just another burden that you carry. And to me, it's a really heavy and negatively impactful burden, especially because it continues to exist invisibly. And I know it keeps me up at night when I walk through this office looking at my desk and I'm like, it's Saturday. Maybe I can spend like an hour and I won't feel so behind on this project. And I have to be like, no, it's Saturday and you're not being paid for this. And that technical debt comes from a lineage of rock stars and ninjas and a culture of moving fast and breaking things and walking away from things that are broken instead of slowly fixing them and taking accountability and addressing them. And most of my technical debt has come from white men who mean really well, and they didn't mean for it to ruin my job, and they continue to help me to fix it. But that, it's not necessarily their fault. It's also the fault of organizations and systems and cultures that created this space in which we don't recognize that this is debt and that this is bad, and that we need to sit down and think about things when we're creating projects and think about who we're handing off them to and whether we're supporting that person to take on that debt. So this is me starting a fire to recognize the importance of and celebrating and addressing technical debt so that we can get further and all of you and me can get out of this really, really dark road to burnout. So if there's a lot going against you, I see you, I acknowledge you, and I recognize that you have come really far where you have today. And thank you for the honor for sharing this with you today. Yeah, I'm on Twitter, and here's a link to the slides. Love you. Thank you.
Yes, Fatima.
Woo! Yes!